Airport staff question, harass, and doubt a black woman's right to a first-class ticket, then fall silent with shock when airline executives greet her as Captain Bennett. The sky had always called to Zara Bennett. Even as a little girl growing up in a small apartment in Chicago, she would press her face against the window whenever a plane passed overhead. She would follow its path until it disappeared, wondering what it felt like to be up there, above the clouds. Now, at 35, Captain Zara Bennett knew exactly what it felt like. After 12 years as a commercial pilot, the sky had become her second home. She had earned every minute of her flight time, every stripe on her uniform. As Zara rolled her suitcase through the sliding doors of Atlanta International Airport, she checked her watch. 4 hours until her flight to Los Angeles. Plenty of time to get through security and prepare for the pre-flight briefing. She wore dark jeans and a simple blue button-up shirt, comfortable clothes for her journey to the airport. Her pilot's uniform hung neatly in the garment bag slung over her shoulder. Today's flight was special. Not just a regular route, but a high-profile direct flight to Los Angeles, carrying several celebrities and business executives. The kind of assignment that showed her airline trusted her skills. The kind that reminded her how far she had come. Zara remembered her first flight, lesson at 17. She had saved for 2 years working at her uncle's hardware store to afford it. The small flight school outside Chicago had few female students and even fewer black ones. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" the instructor had asked when she showed up. She thought about her mother working double shifts as a nurse to help her through flight school. About the loan applications rejected, the scholarships that barely covered books. About the flight instructor who forgot to sign her flight hours until Captain James Peterson stepped in. James was one of the first black commercial pilots in the country. He had spotted Zara at a career day, seen the hunger in her eyes when she looked at pictures of cockpits. "This industry won't make it easy for you," he had told her. "But if flying is in your blood, nothing should keep you grounded." James became her mentor, her champion. When she wanted to quit after a particularly rough flight assessment, he showed up at her apartment with pizza and stories of his own struggles. "They'll tell you 1,000 reasons why you can't do it," he had said. "Your job is to show them the one reason you can." Now, 12 years into her career, Zara was one of only a handful of black female captains in commercial aviation. Less than 1% of all commercial pilots were black women. She felt the weight of that statistic every time she put on her uniform, every time she walked through an airport. But she also felt pride. Each flight was another crack in that glass ceiling. Each safe landing was proof that the sky belonged to everyone. Initial conflict. Set-up Zara paused to observe the busy terminal. Families hugged goodbye at security. Business travelers rushed past, phones pressed to their ears. Gate agents directed travelers, some with smiles, others with barely concealed impatience. She noticed how differently people were treated at check-in. The first-class passengers received warm smiles and immediate assistance. Economy passengers were processed efficiently, but with less personal attention. Interesting, but not surprising. What would happen when she approached? Zara headed for the first-class counter. As the captain of today's flight, she'd use the priority line to check in before changing into her uniform in the crew lounge. She pulled her ID and ticket from her bag as she approached. 2 gate agents stood behind the counter. The man appeared to be in his 50s, with thinning brown hair and a name tag that read, Bradley, 20 years of service. The woman was younger, maybe mid-20s, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. Her tag read, Valerie. Good. Morning, Zara said with a smile, placing her ticket and ID on the counter. I'm checking in for the Los Angeles flight. Bradley glanced at her, then at her ticket, then back at her. His smile tightened. First class? He asked, his tone making it sound like a question that shouldn't need to be asked. Yes, Zara replied. Simply. He picked up her ID, studying it with narrowed eyes, then looked at her ticket again. And this is definitely your ticket? Bradley asked, his voice louder than necessary. Yes, it is. Zara kept her voice even, though she felt her shoulders tense. She'd been through this before. Bradley turned the ticket over, as if searching for something wrong with it. Economy check-in is down there, he said, pointing to the longer line to the right. I'm aware, Zara said, but as you can see, I have a first-class ticket. Valerie leaned over to look at the ticket, then whispered something to Bradley. They both smirked. Just making sure you didn't misunderstand, Bradley said. We get that. A lot. People think they have first class when they actually don't. Zara took a slow, deep breath. I understand my ticket perfectly. ID and ticket don't always match, Bradley continued, holding her license up to the light as if checking for a forgery. We have to be careful these days. People in line behind Zara were starting to notice the delay. A few exchanged glances. One businessman checked his watch with an annoyed expression. Is there a problem? Zara asked, keeping her voice professional despite the heat rising in her cheeks. Well, Bradley said, his voice rising again. It seems like there might be a misunderstanding about your ticket assignment. Maybe you could step aside while I check something. Other travelers were now openly staring. Valerie had a small smile on her face, as if enjoying the show. Zara stood her ground. There's no misunderstanding. I'd like to speak to a supervisor, please. Before Bradley could respond, a voice called from behind him. Captain Bennett, I didn't know you were flying today. A young man in a pilot's uniform approached from the crew door. First Officer Kevin Santos, one of the pilots Zara had trained last year. He looked confused by the scene in front of him. Is everything okay? Kevin asked, looking between Zara and the gate agents. Bradley's face changed instantly. Captain? He repeated. Zara felt the familiar knot in her stomach. She had been here before. That moment when someone realized they had misjudged her. Sometimes it led to apologies. More often it led to deeper resentment. Yes, Captain Bennett is flying the LA route today, Kevin said cheerfully, unaware of the tension. Bradley's smile didn't reach his eyes. Well, how were we supposed to know? That? He gestured at Zara's casual clothes. No uniform, no identification. Zara took another deep breath. Stay calm. Stay professional. Every instinct told her to pull out her pilot's ID to end this humiliation. But another part of her thought about all the black passengers who didn't have a captain's badge to rescue them from moments like this. I presented my ID and ticket, Zara said evenly. That should have been sufficient. Let me get a supervisor. To sort this out, Bradley said, picking up the phone. He lowered his voice, but Zara still heard him say, possible fraudulent ticket situation at first class. The word fraudulent hung in the air. Zara felt her face grow warm, but kept her expression neutral. The line behind her had grown. People shifted uncomfortably, some pretending to check their phones, others openly watching the drama. A young black girl, maybe 9 or 10, stood in line with her mother. She stared at Zara with wide eyes. Zara gave her a small, reassuring smile. This is what representation meant, not just being in the cockpit, but being seen standing your ground. While they waited, Kevin tried to smooth things over. I can vouch for Captain Bennett. She's one of our most senior pilots. We have procedures, Bradley insisted. We need to verify this situation. Zara had faced this situation countless times before. She remembered her first day in uniform, when a passenger had looked at her stripes and asked, "Are you really the pilot?" She recalled the flight where a man had refused to board after seeing her in the cockpit, demanding a more experienced pilot. She thought about the countless times she had been mistaken for a flight attendant, even in her pilot's uniform. Kevin looked uncomfortable. "I should get to the briefing room," he said to Zara. "Do you want me to tell them you're dealing with an issue?" "I'll be there shortly," Zara assured him. "This won't take long." A few minutes later, a white man in his 40s approached the supervisor's office. His name tag read, Kevin Barnes, Supervisor. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, addressing only Bradley. "This woman insists she has a first-class ticket," Bradley explained, emphasizing insists as if her claim was doubtful. "But something doesn't seem right about it." Supervisor Kevin finally looked at Zara. "Ma'am, can I see your—" "Ticket and ID?" Zara had already handed over both. "They're right there on the counter." Bradley pushed them toward his supervisor. "We just want to make sure everything is legitimate." "I understand, but—" Zara began. "We have protocols," Bradley interrupted. "Security is important." Valerie nodded vigorously. "We're just doing our jobs." Zara noticed a pattern. Every time she tried to speak, they talked over her. Every time she started to explain, they interrupted with procedures and protocols. It was as if her voice didn't matter. More airline staff gathered around the counter, looking at her ticket and ID. The scene was growing, becoming a spectacle. Passengers openly stared now. Some looked annoyed at the delay. Others seemed embarrassed on her behalf. A few wore small, satisfied smiles, as if seeing someone put in their place gave them pleasure. Public humiliation. "I just don't understand why this is necessary," Zara said firmly. "I presented valid identification and a legitimate ticket. We have the right to verify any passenger documentation that seems unusual," Bradley said, his confidence growing with each passing moment. His tone became more condescending. "Perhaps you're not familiar with airline procedures." Zara almost laughed at the irony. She knew airline procedures better than anyone at this counter. She had literally written some of the safety protocols for this very airline. She made a decision. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out her phone and pressed record. "I'd like to document this interaction," she said calmly. "For my own records." Supervisor Kevin's expression changed immediately. He straightened his tie. "Ma'am, there's no need for that. We're just following standard procedures." "I understand," Zara replied. "And I'm following my standard procedure of documenting situations where I feel my identification is being questioned. Beyond normal verification." Bradley's face flushed red. "You can't record us without permission," he protested, though there was no such rule. "Actually, in a public space like this, she can," said a voice from the line. A white businessman in an expensive suit stepped forward. "I've been watching this whole interaction, and I have to say it seems excessive. The lady clearly has a valid ticket. Why is this taking so long?" Supervisor Kevin turned to him immediately. "Sir, I apologize for the delay. We're just being thorough." "Seems like you're being something else," the man said pointedly. "I have the same first-class ticket, and you processed me in 30 seconds. Zara felt a complex wave of emotions. She was grateful for the support, but frustrated that this man's words carried instant weight when hers had been dismissed repeatedly. Bradley's face hardened. This isn't your concern, sir. Maybe it should be someone's concern, the businessman replied. Maybe I should contact customer relations about how you're treating passengers. Supervisor Kevin raised his hands in a calming gesture. Let's all take a step back. There's no need to escalate this. I agree, Bradley said, his voice rising. Which is why I think we should call security. If there's nothing wrong with the ticket, there should be no problem with a security check. The word security created an immediate ripple effect. Passengers backed away slightly. Zara continued recording, her hand steady even as her heart raced. You're calling security because I'm trying to check in with a valid first-class ticket? She asked, making sure her voice was clear on the recording. We're calling security because you're being difficult, Bradley said, reaching for the phone. Sir, I wouldn't touch her phone, the businessman advised. That would be unfortunate. A uniformed security officer approached, walking briskly toward the growing scene. Zara stood tall, maintaining her dignity despite the public humiliation. She had faced worse. She would face this too. Just as the security officer reached them, a voice called out from across the terminal. Captain Bennett, there you are! A man in an airline executive uniform hurried toward them. Michael Torres, the airline's vice president of operations, looked confused by the gathering of staff. Mike, Zara said with relief. I was just trying to check in. Michael looked at the cluster of staff, the security officer, and Zara's phone still recording. His expression changed from confusion to concern. What exactly is happening here? He asked. Mike, good to see you, Zara said, her voice steadier than she felt. Michael Torres wasn't alone. Behind him stood Daniel Reynolds, the airline's operations director, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a commanding presence. Daniel had been with the airline for over 30 years and was respected by everyone from baggage handlers to executives. Captain Bennett, Daniel said warmly, extending his hand. We were just reviewing the flight roster for today. You've got quite the passenger list for the LA flight. The word captain hit like a thunderclap. Bradley's mouth fell open. Supervisor Kevin froze. Valerie stepped back slightly, suddenly finding something interesting on the floor to look at. I was just trying to check in, Zara explained, gesturing to her ticket and ID still on the counter. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. The gathered staff, the security officer, Zara's phone recording the interaction, the line of staring passengers. Your ticket? He asked, picking it up from the counter. Is there some issue with it? Apparently they needed to verify it, Zara said simply. Bradley jumped in, his voice suddenly respectful. There was just a misunderstanding, sir. We didn't realize Captain Bennett was what? Daniel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. A first-class passenger with a valid ticket? Or a captain? With this airline for the past 12 years? The security officer, sensing he wasn't needed, began to back away. We were just following protocol, Supervisor Kevin explained weakly. Which protocol would that be? Michael asked. The one where you create a public spectacle questioning a passenger's valid documentation? Or the one where you call security? On one of our most senior pilots? Daniel turned to the gathering crowd. Folks, we apologize for the delay. Everyone will be helped shortly. He then gestured for Bradley, Supervisor Kevin, and Valerie to step aside with him. Though his voice was low, Zara could see from their expressions that the conversation was intense. Bradley's face reddened. Supervisor Kevin kept nodding. Valerie looked close to tears. Zara stopped recording and put her phone away. The immediate crisis was over, but the familiar weight of it all still pressed on her shoulders. One more incident, one more battle, one more day of having to prove she belonged. The businessman who had spoken up gave her a nod of respect. An older woman in line whispered, "Good for you, honey." Others looked away, embarrassed to have been silent witnesses. Zara glanced at the young black girl who had been watching. The girl's eyes were wide, but not with distress anymore, with wonder. Her mother leaned down and whispered something in her ear, pointing subtly towards Zara. The girl smiled shyly. That smile made it worth it. That was why Zara endured these moments. That girl needed to see someone who looked like her stand her ground. Daniel returned, leaving the staff huddled together, looking thoroughly chastised. "Captain Bennett, I can't express how sorry I am," he said. "This is completely unacceptable." "It's not the first time," Zara replied simply. "I know." Daniel's expression was grim. "And that's the problem." Zara looked at her watch. She still had time before her pre-flight duties. She could walk away now, head to the crew lounge, and put this behind her. It would be easier, but the girl's face stayed with her. Some battles weren't just for yourself. "I'd like to address this situation," Zara said firmly. "Not in a back office, not in a private meeting, right here." Daniel studied her face, then nodded. "Of course." He gestured for Bradley, Supervisor Kevin, and Valerie to join them. They approached reluctantly, eyes downcast. "I want to be clear about what happened here," Zara began, her voice calm but carrying. "This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was a pattern I've seen throughout my career." Bradley started to speak, but Daniel silenced him with a look. "When I approached this counter with a valid first-class ticket, you immediately assumed I didn't belong," Zara continued. "You questioned my ticket repeatedly. You suggested it might be fraudulent. You called security." She turned to the businessman who had spoken up. "When this gentleman intervened, you immediately took him seriously. His words had value to you. Mine did not." Supervisor Kevin shifted uncomfortably. "We would have questioned anyone who seemed—" He trailed off, unable to finish. "Seemed what?" Zara asked. "Out of place? And what made me seem out of place in first class?" The question hung in the air. No one answered, but everyone knew. "This isn't about one incident or one airline," Zara continued. "It's about patterns that affect people who look like me every day. The constant questioning, the assumption that we don't belong in certain spaces, the extra burden of having to prove ourselves over and over." Daniel nodded. "You're absolutely right, Captain Bennett, and we need to address it directly." "I was just doing my job," Bradley protested, finding his voice. "We have security protocols. It had nothing to do with—" "Then why didn't you apply those same protocols to everyone?" Zara asked. "Why was my first-class ticket suspicious when others weren't?" Bradley had no answer. "I don't believe you woke up today planning to discriminate," Zara said, her tone softening slightly. "But we all have biases. The question is whether we recognize them and work to change them." A new person joined their circle, a black woman, in her 40s with short, natural hair and a sharp gray suit. Her badge identified her as Dr. Amara Okafor, Chief Diversity Officer. "Captain Bennett," she said, extending her hand. "Daniel called me. I'm very sorry about what happened." "Dr. Okafor will be handling this situation from here," Daniel explained. "With your permission, she'd like to use your recording for training purposes." Zara nodded. "If it helps prevent this from happening to someone else, absolutely." She glanced at her watch again. "I need to prepare for my flight." "Of course," Daniel said. "Your bag will be checked through. I'll personally escort you to the crew lounge." Dr. Okafor turned to Bradley, Supervisor Kevin, and Valerie. I'd like all of you to come with me to my office. Now." Their faces showed a mix of defensiveness and genuine regret. As they turned to leave, Bradley looked back at Zara. "I really was just following—" "Save it for Dr. Okafor," Daniel interrupted. "Captain Bennett has a plane to fly." As Zara walked away with Daniel, she passed the young black girl and her mother. "Excuse me," the mother said softly. "My daughter wants to ask you something." Zara paused, kneeling slightly to meet the girl's eyes. "What is it?" "Are you really a pilot?" the girl asked, her voice filled with awe. Zara smiled, the weight on her shoulders lightening just a bit. "Yes, I am. I fly big planes." "I want to be a pilot, too," the girl whispered. "Then you will be," Zara told her. "Don't let anyone tell you that you can't." She stood and continued walking, head high. Behind her, she heard the girl say excitedly to her mother, "Did you hear that? She said I can be a pilot too." That was worth every battle. That was why she kept fighting. In the staff locker room, Zara changed into her uniform with practiced movements. The navy blue fabric with 4 gold stripes on each sleeve felt like armor. She straightened her collar and secured her captain's hat. Checking her appearance in the mirror, Captain Zara Bennett looked back at her. Not the woman who had been questioned and doubted at check-in, but the skilled pilot who had logged over 10,000 flight hours and earned every stripe on her shoulders. She reached for her flight bag and headed to the operations room. Inside, she focused on her pre-flight routine. She checked the weather reports for Atlanta and Los Angeles, noting clear conditions on both ends with some turbulence expected over the Rockies. She reviewed the flight plan, fuel calculations, and passenger count. The familiar routine steadied her, but the morning's events still echoed in her mind. Zara slipped into the bathroom for a moment, alone. She leaned against the sink, took 3 deep breaths, and closed her eyes. "You've been here before," she whispered to herself. "You'll be here again. Keep flying anyway." When she emerged, First Officer Michael Chen was waiting with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her. "Everything okay, Captain?" he asked. His gentle tone suggested he had heard about the incident. "All good," Zara replied with a small smile. "Thanks for the coffee." Michael nodded, not pushing further. He had flown with Zara enough to know and respect her boundaries. At the pre-flight briefing, Zara addressed the cabin crew with clear, confident instructions. She outlined the flight path, expected weather, and special needs of certain passengers. "We have a minor traveling alone in 14C, she noted, "and a passenger with mobility issues in 3A who will need assistance during boarding and deplaning." The flight attendants took notes, asking questions that Zara answered with expert knowledge. No one in this room questioned her authority or expertise. Here, in her professional element, her command was absolute. "And one more thing," she added. "There's a young girl on this flight who wants to be a pilot. If there's a quiet moment during the flight, I'd like to invite her to see the cockpit. Before we land," the lead flight attendant smiled. "We'll make it happen, Captain." Zara led her crew through the terminal toward their gate. The difference in how people perceived her now was striking. Passengers respectfully moved aside. Airport staff nodded in greeting. The uniform spoke before she did, establishing her place in this world. But Zara knew the truth. She was the same person, whether in jeans or a captain's uniform. The world just saw her differently. The aftermath and impact. 2 weeks later, Zara sat in a large conference room at the airline's headquarters. Around the table were Daniel Reynolds, Michael Torres, Dr. Amara Okafor, and several other executives. Captain Bennett, thank you for joining us, Daniel began. Your experience at the Atlanta airport, while deeply unfortunate, has sparked some important changes. Dr. Okafor opened a folder. We've developed a new mandatory training program for all customer-facing staff, she explained. It addresses unconscious bias and provides specific scenarios based on real experiences, including yours, with your permission. You have it, Zara said. Additionally, Michael added, we're reviewing all our customer service protocols to ensure they're applied equally to all passengers. Zara had heard similar promises before, but the folder in front of her contained something different. Actual policy changes with clear consequences for violations, metrics to track improvement, and regular review periods. We'd also like to offer you a new role, Daniel said. In addition to your flying duties, we'd like you to join our pilot recruitment team with a focus on diversifying our ranks. Zara considered the offer. I'll do it on one condition, she said. I want to keep flying regularly. I need to be visible, not just in recruitment materials, but in the cockpit. Absolutely, Daniel agreed. The following month, Bradley and dozens of other gate agents sat in a training room. On the screen played Zara's recording from the incident, followed by interviews with passengers who had faced similar treatment. Some staff members crossed their arms defensively. Others took notes, their expressions thoughtful. Bradley sat somewhere in between, uncomfortable, but listening. Dr. Okafor led the discussion. The question isn't whether bias exists, she said. The question is what we do about it. That same week, Zara stood in front of a classroom of high school students for career day. The room was filled with young faces of all colors, many of them girls who had never considered aviation as a possibility. When I was your age, I only knew one black female pilot, and I had never met her in person, Zara told them. I just knew she existed, and that was enough to make me believe it was possible. Today, I want to be that person for you. After her presentation, Zara opened a letter that had been forwarded to her through the airline. Inside was a carefully drawn picture of an airplane with two people in the cockpit. The note read, Dear Captain Bennett, thank you for my wings. I wear them every day. My mom got me books about airplanes. Someday I will fly big planes like you. Your friend, Jasmine Williams. Zara smiled, tucking the letter back into her flight bag. One moment of standing firm had created ripples she couldn't have imagined. The next morning, Zara guided her Boeing 787 down the runway of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. As the massive machine lifted into the air, she felt the familiar thrill of defying gravity. Through the cockpit window, the sky stretched endlessly before her, vast, open, and free from the barriers of the ground below. Up here, the only limits were physical laws, not the artificial boundaries people created. But Zara knew her work wasn't just in the sky. It was on the ground, in check-in lines and boardrooms and classrooms. It was in standing her ground when others tried to deny her place. It was in making sure the Jasmines of the world had fewer battles to fight and more skies to claim. As the plane climbed through the clouds, Zara thought about how far she had come and how many others would follow the path she was helping to clear. The sky belonged to everyone. And day by day, flight by flight, conversation by conversation, she was making sure the world knew it. 6 months later, Zara approached the check-in counter at Denver International Airport, dressed in casual clothes and pulling her small suitcase. Good. Morning, the gate agent said with a warm smile. Captain Bennett, it's an honor to have you flying with us today. Zara noticed the difference immediately. The agent's name tag had a small rainbow pin beside it. The digital screens around the terminal showed diverse faces in the airline's advertisements. Small changes, but meaningful ones. As she settled into her first-class seat, Zara picked up the in-flight magazine. Her own face looked back at her from an article titled, "Changing the Face of Aviation." The plane began to climb. Outside her window, they broke through a layer of clouds into a clear blue sky. Zara smiled. Some journeys weren't just about the distance traveled, but about how high you could rise.